of webinar we started 2 months ago. This webinar will be on productive growth and institutionalization of shorter working week. The first webinar were on webinars attitude and arguments and the point of view of the public sector towards the 4-day week. And we are very enthusiastic to welcome you today to this first webinar. Our speaker today will be José Luis Gallegos, PhD candidate at the Rotterdam School of Management and also a member of the European Work Time Committee, and also Philipp Frey, for research associate of the Institute of Technology Assessment and also research affiliate at Autonomy. So thank you both for speaking today. Basically, the webinar will organize in 2 parts. The first part is a presentation by you both, 15 minutes each, and afterwards you can ask a question. And for those people attending, the best thing to do is to write a question in the chat or in the Q&A module, and the speaker will take it directly just after the time. So thank you for this, and Jose, I let you start the webinar.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Jose, and today I would like to have a conversation with you about some ideas that I've been working on for potentially an op-ed article that I want to write, where the main argument is that working time is a political question, and that we as a movement, the working time reduction movement, or the 4-day work week movement, we are missing an explicit political strategy. We are talking to various audiences, making all sorts of promises about the virtues of the 4-day work week, but we're missing a core constituency, the people who are actually going to get into the struggle of achieving working time reductions at their workplaces. And I think this is very symptomatic to the fact that we are a decentralized movement, that the 4-day work week is just gaining momentum. I mean, it's not a completely novel idea. It was a hot topic in the 80s, but definitely all the enthusiasm that we see from policymakers, corporations implementing trials, scholars, this is something unforeseen. So I think we are at a right juncture, a right moment to collectively discuss what could be our political strategy. And I think we have a lot to learn from history. So I will also touch upon how did people actually move from 6 to 5 days a week. And I would like to start with this cite from a report of 4-day week global. In one of the reports, they try to summarize the different benefits of the 4-day work week. And among them, you have that it reduces stress and burnout, it's beneficial for companies' bottom lines, it reduces unemployment costs in periods of tight labor markets, it's good for the climate, it reduces commuting, carbon emissions, etc. And when I read this, I don't know about our audience, but when I read it, I feel that we are over-promising, and at the same time that we are not letting people know about the different trade-offs between these goals. So there's an idea that I want to introduce, which is the antinomies of the 4-day work week, the idea that there are promises and narratives of the benefits of this policy, which can lead to contradictory effects and expectations. And just to provide you with a simple example, which is actually from the work of 2 dear colleagues. One is the group Autonomy, and the other one is Pedro Gomez, in which we are saying that the 4-day work week actually helps the environment, but it also fuels the economy. On the one hand, we're saying, well, if you have more free time, this free time allows you to change your habits of consumption, and usually people will move towards low carbon soft activities. So you will spend more time cycling, resting, spending time with your family. But we're also saying that it fuels the economy. So actually having more free time, it means consuming more. And Pedro Gomez actually takes this survey from Gallup in the US, which mentions that Americans increase 20% their consumption when they compare weekends with workdays. And these 2 arguments are actually rooted in very different traditions, because Pedro Gomez is thinking in this multiplier effect of Keynesianism, and this phrase by Henry Ford that if you give workers more free time, then with that free time, they want holidays, they want to buy cars, they incentivize aggregate consumption, and this is good for the economy. And on the other hand, you have the tradition rooted in Juliet Shore and these scholars who are promoting degrowth on the basic assumption that we cannot keep increasing productivity forever, and we actually need to slow down. So you can make the argument that these 2 positions are not necessarily self-contradictory and that they can take place in different contexts, but definitely you cannot have both at the same time. And the same happens, for instance, when we say that the 4-day work week increases autonomy, but it also improves efficiency. So we make the argument that most of the jobs are alienating, particularly low-skilled jobs. They tend to be very mechanical, and this affects occupational balance. So having 1 day off means that you can decide what you do in that day. It increases your autonomy. You have this surplus of autonomy after all. But we're also saying to employers that if they implement the 4-day work week, this could improve their management efficiency. But for this to happen, they will need to have more control on the production process because they need to change the way work is organized. And this means sometimes eliminating unnecessary activities, but it also means eliminating unnecessary workers. So for instance, there is this quote by one of the managers who implemented the 4-day work week in which he says, "This is carrot and stick." This is a carrot and stick policy in that it does come with an expectation from management that employees will be meeting, if not exceeding, performance expectations. If performance expectations aren't met, there might be other people out there that would be better suited to this type of flexible work policies. Now, you can say that this was just an unfortunate quote included in these guidelines for implementing the 4-day work week. But, when you actually look to the report of how we are doing in the trial in the UK, also issued by the Autonomy Group, you find that managers are asking staff to analyze and time each step of the manufacturing process to identify ways to save time and develop a new set of production targets. This actually aligns with a report by Delaney and Casey in 2022, in which they did some ethnographic work with workers in the context of the 4-day work week, and they find that in order to gain some freedom from work, employees were prepared to relinquish some freedom in work. So we have again this trade-off, right? Because we are promising workers that their autonomy will increase, but we are also saying efficiency will increase, which means that autonomy gets reduced at the workplace. And last but not least, we also have this tension between unemployment and productivity. On the one hand, we're saying, well, actually, this could help to reduce unemployment because taking 20% of working time, it means that you require to hire new people, right, to make up for this deficit. But at the same time, we're telling employers, well, you actually don't have to worry because these personnel that now are more rested, they will be also more creative, they will be more engaged with their jobs, they will be more satisfied, and as a result, productivity will not suffer. Actually, productivity might actually increase. And these two goals are not compatible because on the one hand, you're saying you do need a deficit in output if you want these corporations to hire new employees. And this whole argument that this could help to redistribute the gains of productivity derived from automation and artificial intelligence, this can only happen if you actually have this deficit. Otherwise, you have net zero effects or even an increase in productivity. And at the end of the day, this doesn't work as a work sharing policy in that way. Then again, it might be the case that every of these effects occur in different contexts, but you cannot have both at the same time. Which actually reminds me of a very famous thinker, Isaiah Berlin. He said that some public values are incommensurable, or another way of saying it is that we cannot make everyone happy at the same time. And Isaiah Berlin, he departed from the idea that if we believe that there is an objective common good that is identifiable by everyone just by using our reasoning, and if we identify that there are actually competing values and that everyone has their own interest, then that opens up the possibility of politics, right? Because then it means that we need to reconcile different interests, but there's never one that is absolute and beyond everyone else. And this agony and this conflict, he says, are of central importance for the freedom to choose. So it's actually good that these objectives are not completely harmonic, but we need to recognize that and we need to embrace the trade-offs. And I think it's better that we do it earlier than later because there's also now starting to appear more critical papers on the potential effects of the 4-day work week. So we have this paper by Timothy Campbell, in which he does a systematic review on all the trials and experiments of the 4-day work week. One of the findings is that increases in productivity is inconclusive or questionable. Then we have this more harsher paper by Hugo Coelho, issued by the European Commission, in which he actually focuses on more recent trials. And he's pretty much saying that the quality of these trials, the rigor and validity is really questionable. And you can have a lot of endogeneity problems because they never control for different variables. So you can have, for instance, that employees are actually increasing their productivity, not because of the working time arrangement, but because they are pressured and it's like a self-fulfilling promise in which they want to please the managers, or they want to keep up with the promise of a high output. And then it's not really because of the policy, but because these expectations that you get these results. He also makes the argument that the managerial personality might influence. And then we also find some problems, like, for instance, the pilot implemented by Microsoft in Japan, the way they were measuring productivity was based on sales. And if you measure sales as your standard of productivity, then there are a lot of environmental variables that come into play. So why is this important? Because I think we need to recognize that we cannot have it both ways, that we need to prioritize the objectives of our movement, and we need to define a clear theory of change. We need to conceptualize who is our core constituency and our secondary supporters. Right now, I mean, so far I have said that we don't have a theory of change, but I think we do. It's just that it's very implicit. But when you hear people talking about the 4-day work week, they usually give you this narrative that, you know, in one country there is this great innovator, entrepreneur who gets to convince other fellow industrialists. Then they get to industry level agreement, and eventually, you know, they get to persuade the government to implement a national policy, which then spreads around the world. And they usually take as a reference the way we moved from 6 to 5 days, and the influence of Henry Ford in his fellow American industrialists, you know, until they got into this iron and steel agreement. They mentioned a lot the Fair Labor Standard Act of 1938 and some of the recommendations issued by the International Labour Organization. But when we go back to history and when we look more critical perspectives on how this process actually happened, we see that not everyone thinks this was the best way to go. So one of those authors is David Roediger. He has this essay called The Limits of Corporate Reform, Fordism, Taylorism, and the Working Week in the United States. And he makes the argument by comparing these 2 decades that actually Fordism was not, it didn't play such a huge influence in the working time reduction. He compares 1909, from 1909 to 1919, to the second decade, which is 1919 to 1929. And he says in the first decade, we actually see a reduction of 7 hours. And in the second decade, we only saw a reduction of 1.3 hours. He, of course, is taking 2 different data points from different time series. One is the Jones series, and the other is the Owen series. But if you do the average of both changes, you see that there's actually true. No, there was a significant difference between the first decade and the second decade. Now, when you look this in the bigger picture, you find that changes in working time were consistent from 1909 to 1919, and then there's some type of stagnation from 1919 to 1929. Now, of course, Henry Ford implemented his pilot in 1926, so it was in the second decade. But the argument Roediger is making is that in this first half of the decade, you had a lot of influence of Taylorism and already Fordist kind of ideas, right? So his main argument is that the effect on Taylorism and Fordism is minimal, and there's something that happens before which actually, in his opinion, was more effective. And what happened between 1909 and 1919? Well, he makes the argument that labor unions played a significant role. They were actually, you know, sending a lot of strikes and putting a lot of pressures on local governments to establish state-level working time regulations. But also the government played a major role. You know, in that decade, 1909 to 1919, you have the First World War, and as a result, the government imposed very vertical guidelines on how production should be run, and they were really worried about preventing fatigue. So at the end of the day, these were the 2 main drivers that actually changed the way things were doing, from which we can conclude that it was actually labor unions and the government the main drivers for working time reduction, or at least greater influence than the influence of Henry Ford and the Taylorist movement. This, of course, sets 2 different approaches, right? One is persuading managers and industrialists of what is the most optimal way of doing things and why is this so convenient for them. And the other one is organizing labor and actually having a collective bargaining and expecting that the government plays a significant role in also defining working time policies. I think this is just food for thought. We can, from these ideas, start the discussion. But yeah, I think it changes a bit the narrative that usually we hear about how we achieved the 5-day work week. So yeah, that's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you, José, for your presentation. Maybe before we move to the debate, we will have Philipp, and we can have also after that for all debate. So Philipp, if you want to take the lead for next.
First of all, I have to apologize a little bit. I've been sick at the beginning of the week and I still feel a bit queasy, but I hope the presentation will be fine nonetheless. Okay, so in today's session, we wanted to take a look back basically to learn lessons to build towards a better future. And I want to comment a little bit on historical development of working times. José also covered it a bit, but I will focus on the German case, and of productivity in the big picture. All the graphs I will be showing are for Germany, if I remember correctly, but they could have been done for most other countries as well, because we are dealing with real macroeconomic trends that have been more or less consistent across different economies. So the first slide I want to show you is the development of productivity since the 1950s, and we can see that it basically increased by a factor of 7 until the 2017. It's the cutoff date. And if you would take an even larger historical perspective, it would be even more impressive. Compared to the 19th century, actually, workers in Germany are 24 times roughly as productive than per working hour than they were before today. So quite impressive. What led to this development? Industrial revolution is the answer. So I took this graph from some other paper that was published. You can argue about the details, but I think the general picture is quite clear. You have the first industrial revolution, sometime starting maybe in the 18th century, for sure in the 19th century, the mechanization of production, which increased productivity by a lot, and the introduction of railroads and steam power. In the beginning, actually, the Industrial Revolution was still powered by water power, which is kind of interesting. And then later on, you have the second Industrial Revolution with the electrification of production, the establishment of assembly line production and mass production, which ultimately culminated in the Taylorist production regime. And after the Second World War, we entered the age of automation with robotics coming up, computer systems, and now we talk about the fourth Industrial Revolution, or maybe it's just a continuation of the third. It's not that important for this talk, I think, with big data applications, AI, and so on. So this gives you a general, very broad idea of what happened on a technological level and why productivity, or what technological tools have been used to skyrocket productivity. And yet we have extremely high labor market participation rates. So still, there are more people employed as a share of the population than in earlier times. And this leads many people in science to ask, well, why are there still so many jobs? It's actually a title by David Author. It's a very nice paper. And I think the answer is rather easy. First of all, you have an exploding GDP as well. Decreased employment simply because more stuff was produced. And the other factor, which we are more concerned with, is that working times have drastically reduced. You can see here for Germany, the full-time week has fallen from over 80 hours in the 19th century to below 40 hours at the end of the 20th century. So what we can see here is already that an economy can at the same time grow a lot, get richer, and still work less. So the big picture lesson that we should take from this, I think, from this historical development, is that we shouldn't be talking so much about the number of working hours, which has a very strong debate, at least in Germany. When you come to demographic change, for instance, I will address that a little later. People are saying, okay, you need to work longer hours so we can sustain our wealth. But as a matter of fact, we have decreased our hours of labor per week drastically, and yet we are times doesn't more enjoy a way better lifestyle than we did before. The forms that this actually took, I mean, Jose also already dealt with it a little bit, but what we can see in this graph is basically there is a secular trend towards shorter working times. And in a way, the discussions we are now having across Europe is a return to normality and a promise of progress that has actually persisted ever since the 19th century. So we should be talking... Sorry?
Ich bin gerade in einer Konferenz, wo es Produktivitätswachstum
okay, could you maybe mute? That would be nice, thanks. So largely we are just returning to a form of normality if we are returning now towards a trajectory towards a 4-day work week. But then again, there is no automatism, as we can see. So in the last 30 years, roughly, ever since 1990, work time reductions in Germany have stalled, and I think across most of Europe. And what you can see actually here in blue is what actually happened. So we see a decrease in working time towards the 1990s, and then it basically levels out at around 38 hours. And if you just continue the trend that we had before 1990, you actually would be at a 32-hour week now, today. So what has happened? I mean, it's not the case that there were no actual working time reductions. I can show that in the next slide. There have been working time reductions, but they are based on an increased trend of decoupling of full-time working weeks and actual working hours. So what you can basically see is that in the 1970s, the average working week was very close to the full-time working week. And then it decouples more and more and more. And now what you can see is that actually today, the average worker in Germany is already working less than a 30-hour work week. But the full-time work week is still at 38 hours. So you see a decoupling there. And actually, you might be inclined to say, well, isn't that great? I mean, people are basically free to choose how long they actually want to work. So isn't it good that this kind of full freedom to employees is afforded by our economy? Well, I mean, on the one hand, it's nice that people can choose to work shorter working times, but at the same time, this decoupling mostly happened because more and more women entered the labor market. And they entered the labor market mostly in part-time work positions, or at least a lot more than male workers. to reconcile their private care responsibilities, so to have a work-life or work-family balance, basically. But this introduces the risk that they will actually be faced with poverty when they reach old age. So they actually take a decision to conduct a private care work, and which is an extremely societal important issue and role. And then at the same time, they are basically in a way they have to pay for it out of their own pocket. I mean, while they are doing it, and also in the old age. So still, I mean, what might be an interesting argument is that if we have an average working time already of around 40 hours a week, it might not be so much of an issue whether the economy can afford to go to a 4-day work week, but rather it's an issue of how are working times distributed across the population, basically. Because, I mean, in theory, you could have just as many working hours in the economy with a 30-hour work week than we have now if you have a very equal distribution of these working times. And the issue remains basically that if we have working time reductions as a freedom of choice model, basically, then individual workers have to pay for it, and that shouldn't be the case. And why I think that I will show in the next slide. So I return now to the original productivity graph. You remember, like 7 times as productive. And now you have in blue another entry for the real wages per hour. And what you can see is basically that up until the, let's say, 1980s, they developed almost perfectly in match. So as productivity increased, the hourly wages also increased. And then there is a certain stagnation already in the 1980s. And then again, rather dynamic growth, and then a very strong decoupling in around the year 2000. And this has to do with neoliberal labor market reforms in Germany, with the pressures of globalization, with a decrease in unionization rates. So overall, labor has simply been in a poor condition for the last 30 or so years. And what you can also see is that productivity has roughly increased by around 20% more than wages have. So in other words, if we just have a labor share and a fair participation in the productivity per hour, then we had in the 1970s and also in the 1980s and all the time before then, after the Second World War, you already would have a 4-day work week with no loss in pay and still full staffing levels, basically. So you can argue from there maybe that we should have, speaking about, for example, drives by trade unions and so on, we should already have the 4-day work week, and it's perfectly possible to finance it simply because productivity is already way higher than 30 years ago, but workers have seen very, very little from it. And actually, I think that's a thesis that not only trade unionists would subscribe to, or progressive politicians or scientists or something like that, but also very large institutions largely share that assessment, in the sense that the ILO and the OECDs both have published studies which basically show that an unequal participation in increased productivity in the last decades have been one of the central drivers of social polarization, basically. So that workers didn't get a fair share of increased productivity is basically the reason why our societies today are so much more unequal than 30 or 40 years ago. Okay, so maybe we should be asking, why don't we have the 4-day week yet? And also, I think there's an argument to be made that actually it would be good for technological progress in general, and not just for individual workers, if we would have a 4-day work week. And that's the last slide I would like to conclude on. So the fact that labor has become so cheap, and that there was a very uneven participation in real wages when it comes to productivity growth, is not just bad on an individual level, but it also disincentivizes investment into new technologies, because it basically increases the relative costs of automation. If you can get human labor very cheap, there's very little incentive to invest into new robots, for instance. And you can actually see that in the statistics in a way, I would argue. You can see here that in the 1970s, productivity growth in Germany was still at around 5% on average per year, and now it has to drop to just 1%. And at the same time, gross capital formation, which is basically an index for investment into productive capacities, fell from 35% to 20%. And those two are almost perfectly correlated. So if you invest more into technology and into capital, basically productivity increases more. If you invest less, productivity increases less. So and I think one of the key links that we have to emphasize is that shorter working times actually induce productivity increases, because they increase the hourly wages of workers, thereby decreasing the relative costs of automation. Actually, there's a very nice study already from the 1970s or 80s, I think, from the ILO, which calls working time reductions a productivity whip. So, which is, I think, a nice picture, basically. It whips capital into action and to invest into new technologies. And I think this is something that is actually attractive as a general argument also towards policymakers, because if we want to talk about making our economy more future ready, I think it's a key issue to actually increase productivity. And I think the possibilities for that are there. I mean, for Germany, for instance, there was a study by the Bertelsmann Foundation which showed that frontier companies are 2.5 times as productive as the laggards in industrial manufacturing, and in service work, the best companies are actually 5 to 7 times as productive. And what you can also show is that those companies basically invest way more into capital. And so we can see it's not about some futuristic AI technology that still needs to be developed, but we could massively increase the productivity of our economies if we just invested more. And again, working time reductions are an incentive to invest more into labor-saving technologies. And largely, to make the argument a bit broader about a future-ready economy, at least in Germany, when we talk about 4-day work week, we face a massive debate around demographic change, as I already mentioned initially. And the basic argument goes something like this. We will lose around 10% of our labor force, roughly, in the next 30 to 40 years. And against that backdrop, it would be inconceivable to actually reduce working hours, because you need to get as much work out of the individual worker as possible. That's the basic argument. And I would say, I mean, if we can just increase our productivity increase from 1 to 2% or something like that, then actually we will be way more we will be way richer and more productive with 90% of the workforce than if you have 100% of the workforce and you work them to death, basically, but they are simply very unproductive per hour. And I think this argument that if you want to reconcile dynamic technological change and workers' interests, working time reductions are the way to go, because you decrease the relative cost of automation and you increase acceptance by workers, basically, for technological innovation, is something that is reasonable to do. And as we can see, historically speaking, that has been sort of like the success model of Western or developed economies. The only issue that I see is that it might not be sustainable. So that might be one of those clear conflicts that José alluded to, that we have to talk about whether actually we want to generate economic growth as much as possible or not. But that's something of an issue of economic priorities, basically. Okay, yeah, thanks for your attention.
Thanks, Philipp, for your presentation. So now it's time of the debate. I think you have already one question or remarks of Sonia on the chat. Maybe I think it's for José, but Philipp, you can come in. And now the idea is that you write down a question or raise your hand in the Zoom so we can start a debate around your two presentation. So what do you want to go first on the question of Sonia, maybe?
Yeah, shall I read it first?
Yeah, maybe.
So Sonia says, I sometimes wonder if the 4-day work week is a metaphor for work time reduction, which is blocking other, perhaps more creative ideas. I agree that we must focus on clear talking points. And then she asks, would you suggest we should be more critical of the 4-day week and focus more on other ideas? Well, I think, I mean, I understand that there are different ways of framing working time reduction, and that some people might prefer to have a general reduction of the workday instead of taking 1 day off. What I think, or the argument that I was trying to raise, is that we need at least to be clearer with what is the goal that we are trying to achieve with this working time reduction, right? Because if, for instance, the main goal we are trying to reach is fueling the economy, and we believe that achieving that would be possible if we actually coordinate the whole economy into a 4-day work week, so that people have 1 day off in which they can have more leisure and spend more, and that having, you know, like an overall effect on the aggregate demand. If this is the way to go, then we need a 4-day work week, right? And this would be the best arrangement. But if we don't have clarity on the objectives and also how these objectives cluster together, then we are saying that the 4-day work week can be a policy that solves all our problems. And I think this is very unrealistic. So personally, I don't have a problem with the term 4-day work week. And I actually think that if this is something that is gaining momentum, and if people are already framing working time reduction in this way, that might be something in our advantage to move forward into working time reduction. However, I think we need to be clearer with the objectives that we as a movement are trying to attain.
Yeah, maybe if I can comment very quickly. I just want to point out two things. I think the 4-day work week is simply a very good label by now for working time reductions. And I think also there's something qualitatively attractive about having a whole day free rather than like 1 or 2 hours less per day, because their work intensification can very quickly happen, basically in a less in a less good way, maybe. But what I find kind of disturbing from a German perspective is that there's a lot of companies by now in Germany who claim to offer a 4-day work week, but it's like a 4 times 9 hour model or 4 times 10 hour or something like that. And in Belgium, even you had this legislation where you basically can work 40 hours, but on 4 days. And I mean, that's a 4-day work week. I mean, this would be the main concern for me regarding a 4-day work week. But I think by now it has been simply, it has become a good symbol. And you have to hope that there can be some way to simply establish that a 4-day work week also means 32 hours, so actual working time reductions. And I think the trade unions, at least talking from a German perspective, have to play a key role there to basically establish a best practice of a 4-day work week. And I think also, as a quick comment on your presentation, José, I mean, industrial relations work differently in different countries, I assume. But clearly in Germany, if we have any hope to win a 4-day work week, it will come through collective bargaining, because our industrial relations have a very, very strong focus on collective bargaining and bargaining agreements, basically. So that will be the way forward, ultimately. But I mean, I think it's very nice to have all these trials, to have like a positive message to point towards. I mean, companies can introduce them by themselves, and it works, and it's very nice, and it's good for everyone, and so on. And in a sense, I'm not sure whether actually we need to figure out some of those contradictions, or whether it's actually helpful if you talk to different audiences and you want to reach different audiences. I mean, you open yourself up to criticism, clearly, if it's very contradictory, but that you emphasize certain arguments for a specific audience and others for a different audience, I think it can also be a part of a political strategy, right? Okay, more questions?
Yeah.
Well, otherwise, I can make a comment, because it's good that you clarified what do we mean when we say the 4-day work week, right? I missed that element. But in all the examples that I was presenting, I meant not the compressed 10-hour per day, 40 hours work week, but rather this 32-hour work week in which you also keep 100% of your wage, so you don't have a reduction on your payment. So just to clarify that these were the concept that I was using. And to the point that you mentioned, I think it's interesting, because yeah, you can make the argument that from a tactical perspective, you can engage different audiences, right? But I think, yeah, on the one hand, you open yourself to the criticism that you mentioned, and I see these papers coming up more constantly, really trying to be critical to the benefits on the work week. And if you defeat the idea, you know, if you find the flaws and you say, well, the 4-day work week doesn't work, or doesn't work how they say it, you are allowing the counterpart to frame you, you know, because the fact that we are not being clear in what are the objectives that we are pursuing, it allows the possibility that someone else might build a strong man saying, okay, you know, these guys, they don't even know what they are talking about, because they are mentioning all these benefits that are unrealistic. And I think once you defeat the idea or the concept as a whole, then as a movement, you are more vulnerable. That on the one hand. On the other hand, I think it relates a lot to what is our theory of change, right? Because if we are talking to many audiences, we're also spreading ourselves very thin. And I think that it's actually more a symptom that we don't have clarity who we are talking to, who is our main constituency, who we really want to engage in a conversation, so we get to persuade them to take action, because we don't necessarily agree on what should be our route, our political route. And I think this is a discussion we have to have, because then if you have at least clarity on that, you can recognize the limits in which you can be more pragmatic, and you can allow yourself to get away from, you know, your main talking points, your main narrative. But we first need to build that, right? We first need to have a consistency in our message, so that people know what we are talking about when we say, yeah, we want the 4-day work week, for instance, right?
Thank you, Jose. We have 3 questions. So first, sorry, I don't have your name. It's people with P45 6. If you can open your mic maybe and ask a question directly, it would be better.
I don't know. Maybe that's me, Margareta.
Yeah, sorry, Margareta. I don't have your name, so yeah, I think it's
funny. I don't know why it's like that. Okay, so I would like to think that we have with the 4-day week a symbol of working time reduction that is at the moment very attractive, but has this unclearness, no? And about, is this only a new distribution of the same working hours on 4 days, or is it really shortening of the hours? And else, do you have really shorter working time? Let's say instead of 40 hours, you have 4 times 9 hours, and that's then 36. But if this is with a full compensation of wage, as it was in the Great Britain pilot enterprises, or do you have without it? And else, also, I think we should say, as a European network for the fair sharing of working time, that we really are for a 4-day week with a real shortening of working time and with a full compensation of wage. But else you have the problem that the compensation of staff, of personnel, this is I think what José in the beginning mentioned. There you really have contradictory interests of labor and capital, because the one argument for entrepreneurs to introduce working time reduction or a 4-day week is to have more productive work. But the interest of the workers in most cases should be to get more staff to compensate the outfalling hours. And this is one real contradiction. And else, but I think we have a lot of works, of jobs, where it is possible to reduce working hours or to introduce the 4-day week with reduced working hours without compensation of personnel. This is the case of Great Britain. This was there. They made this 100-80-100. No? And I think we really have to look on the concrete doing. For example, in some cases of, let's say, marketing with many meetings, and so you can make more effective your meetings and you can reduce without compensation of personnel. But for example, in the caring of in a hospital, you will not be able to reduce these hours without compensation of personnel when you don't want to have a cruel worse job in relation to the patient, to the client. So I think we have really to differentiate. And the last differentiation we must do is for, as our Icelandic member mentioned, that for people with caring obligations every day, they in general don't profit from a 4-day week, but more from a daily reduction. No? So we really must differentiate what we promote, what kind of reduction of working time. And else, last remark, the motivation for entrepreneurs to introduce the growing of productivity and the contra effect, what Philipp described, that as already Marx told us, the growing of productivity and wages will introduce more and more cheaper technologies, and so this is a chain we will have always. No? Coming back. Okay.
Thank you, Margareta. Anke, you can have the floor.
Yes. Thank you very much for this nice and kind presentation. Mainly the justification of the arguments is based or was based especially on economic argumentation, especially on the productivity. But at the moment it is not really increasing, and moreover we have a service society for a long time, since a long time. Here, 2/3 of the employees work in this service sector. And this, therefore, my question: how would you be here? How would you be here a productivity growth measure and noticed? So really productivity in economic scales. How do you define here the productivity growth? I think this is also a little bit difficult.
Thank you. Last question, Agnieszka, maybe, and after that, you can add.
Thank you. So apologies, I don't have a camera today, but thank you very much for great presentations. I think the topics that you discussed today are the key topics of at the debate, and your approach was really refreshing and quite interesting. But there was one aspect, I think, from the title about institutionalization of working time reduction that perhaps we could focus on a bit more in our debates, because that's actually crucial. And looking at the past developments, either the shortening of the day, so 8-hour day, or 5-day week, it was, I mean, the way it was institutionalized was always bottom up at some point. This wasn't led by trials or by just individual companies. So perhaps some reflection, or I mean, it's an open question, or just really a reflection whether we can learn something from the past developments and see how this can be indeed implemented at the society-wide level, because the ad hoc experimentation serves the purpose of indeed experimenting, but that never led to society-wide solutions. And this trade-off between productivity or labor standards, perhaps unemployment as rationale for introducing working time reduction, I think that's quite important, and that also surfaced in the discussion that followed. It seems the productivity is mostly guiding the experiments now. This is this 100-80-100. We all talk about productivity, whether we can afford working time reduction, but maybe turning it around and focusing on the social justice argument of indeed labor standards, working conditions that need to be secured, and unemployment. As we now have the increase in the technological unemployment, will also be an important issue, whether that perhaps that should be what drives working time reduction. And my question would be also about when you were doing the review of the history, that I also find fascinating, what happened with the 8-hour working day about 100 years ago. But do you also have some lessons for us from the 5-day week? Because that was more recent, that was, well, from the 60s until the 80s, probably happening in most European countries. Are there any lessons for us to be learned from there, because of the proximity in time, but also the nature of the reduction was more of what the 4-day week wants to achieve? So it's taking 1 day out of the working week from 6 to 5, and now we want to go from 5 to 6. Was that debate in any way similar? Do you have any literature? Have you ever come across any studies that looked at arguments, struggles around those developments? Thank you very much.
Yeah, who should go first? Should I?
You go.
Okay, good. So I mean, we only have a few minutes left, and there's so many issues to touch upon. Can we like extend by 3 to 5 minutes, Adrien? Or
we can extend a bit if people want to stay. It's not a problem.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so first of all, I want to agree with Margareta that actually this issue around what kind of labor market effects do we want to achieve with with working time reductions, and will the working time reductions be in with no loss in pay and no loss in staff, or partly, or something like that? I think it's actually it will be a key issue of contention, because clearly the trade unions will push for full staff compensation, basically, and the employers won't have any if you ask them. Yeah, and we need to be prepared for that. And I think also the answer there needs to be specific to each industry and branch of industry. Even, I mean, you already mentioned the care sector versus advertising, for instance. In industrial manufacturing in Germany, the working week is already mostly 35 hours, and now only losing 3 hours. It's very easy to compensate without additional staffing if you just increase the capital intensity a little bit, so invest into new technology. So it's very different from like care sector. I very much agree on that. And but historically speaking, I think there's this rule of thumb in macroeconomics that working time reductions lead to 50-50. So basically 50% of the working time reductions are compensated by increased productivity, and 50% need to be compensated by staff. But probably it's very unequal across industries. Yeah, so next thing I wanted to quickly comment on is technological unemployment, and so on in general. I mean, of course, you can have increased productivity and no unemployment if you are willing to wreck the planet, simply speaking. I mean, if you are willing to exacerbate the ecological crisis and just go for economic growth, then theoretically you can have endless productivity and endless labor market participation. But I think in today's situation, we should have a talk about industrial policy when it comes to the climate crisis and how much work we can actually still afford. I think that would be something that is key to me. And then just 2 more very brief comments: service society and how can you measure productivity growth there. I mean, I would say as long as it's private companies making a profit, it's rather easy. It's simply GDP per hour worked or revenue per hour worked, also in services as in industrial manufacturing. So you can clearly calculate whether the productivity is high in in software development or something like that. I think it's way more complicated in public service provision. So, for example, hospitals or something like that, because I think you can try to calculate productivity there, but actually it mostly leads to an inhumane system. And at least in Germany, I can say it's simply failing. There was a very big push towards basically bringing the care sector into the rest of the economy and subjugating it to the normal standards of productivity and so on. And it simply doesn't really work. But I think most service work can actually still be measured when you simply take revenue per hour or something like that. And lastly, about this institutionalization, I mean, that wasn't subject of my talk, at least for Germany, I can say. It came down to collective bargaining, essentially, as I mentioned already. And there is actually one very nice study on the role of the DGB and the core arguments in the debate back then. I would be happy to share the paper, but actually it's in German, so I'm not sure whether that's of much help. But maybe you can like computer translate or something. Yeah, yeah. Thanks, José.
Yeah. So I first want to comment on what Agnieszka mentioned regarding the reasons we provide for working time reduction and the idea of unemployment, for instance, right? I think that at this point, we have been focused a lot on providing consequentialist explanations of why the 4-day work week is important. So it is important, or it is possible to the extent that it improves productivity. It improves employee well-being. It doesn't affect the economy. So to the extent that it aligns with an ultimate rationality of efficiency, then we believe that we might be more accepted by any outsider. But I think it relates back to the theory of change that we have, the implicit theory of change, that we need to convince a lot of managers so that they accept to start a trial at their company. And there will be a point of critical mass in which a whole industry might change, and that change will lead to a change in another industry up to the moment that we reach a national or an international consensus. But at least from the research that I've done in the process that they followed in the US, this was never the case. So actually this essay that I cited from Rediger is full of anecdotes and articles written by American industrialists who actually make fun of Henry Ford, and they say that this is a crazy idea, that they are not willing to take part of it. Some of them actually took part of them, and they had the trials, and the results were the opposite. So it showed that productivity didn't increase, and actually output reduced. So this is to say, it was never the case that Henry Ford's innovation persuaded everyone, and then there was this bottom-up approach in which almost by, let's say, like organizational ecologists always suggest that when one organization finds a more efficient way to go, others will follow suit because then it's in their own benefit. Well, at least historically, there is not enough evidence to suggest that this was the case in the US. Rather, there's a lot of evidence to make the case that the government played a bigger role, and the struggles that unions actually had at their workplaces and the strikes and the labor movement were essential. But just to get it back to my main argument, I think we are being focused quite a lot on a consequentialist logic because we believe that we need to prove to these managers that this is a good managerial practice. But when we look at other type of movements, I never saw, Carterists or the suffragists convincing that getting the vote for women or the vote for everyone was good because of the economy. It was aligned with efficiency. I think also taking an approach in which, and Agnieszka mentioned this, this is something fair, this is something just for our society, without at the same time, take some of the pressure on trying to prove that this has so many benefits. And just as a quote, there is this essay also by Paul Lafarge, I think in French is le droit à la paresse, the right of to be lazy. And I really liked his ideas because he didn't have to justify with all these benefits on productivity the right of working time reduction. And he actually suggested 15 hours a week to say or to make the case that workers have the inherent right to enjoy their lives and not spend them just working for capitalists. So this is to say we need, I think, a clearer theory of change so that we know we need to convince and we know the best arguments to make the case. And those arguments ideally should be in harmony with each other, not contradicting each other.
Thank you, José. We arrive at the end of our time, so maybe people have to go somewhere. So thank you all for all your contribution and this discussion. The next webinar will be on September. We'll make a break for the holiday.